And up front here is Michelle Zaks, our Associate Director, who planned every step of this. And I don't think Melissa's here right now. She's probably upstairs working. Those of you who are speakers know Melissa very well. She planned all of your flights, all of your travel, and everything else in between. And Tom Thurston's running around here handling. There you are. Tom is our education director. More on Tom a little later. Okay, welcome to the second session. Welcome back. Special thanks again to Danielle and to Jamil. We could have gone on all morning, at least, with that session. I wish we had. We'll say the same thing here. This session is called The History of United States Education. What's race got to do with it? We weren't trying to write a new song or anything. What's right? No. But we've got educational historians. We've got historians of slavery and race, the Civil War and its aftermath, and historians of education, if I didn't say that. And I'll tell the order in a second, but let me quickly introduce this panel. And again, thank you all for attending, for saying yes, for coming so far. Hasan Kwame Jeffries teaches American history, African American history at Ohio State. He is the author of a number of works, particularly Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. He edited a collection called Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. He's done a 10 episode audible original series of great figures, biographies from the Civil Rights Movement. He'd been involved in all kinds of public history, particularly the renovation of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, the famous Lorraine Hotel where Dr. King was killed. We were both part of introducing or writing prefaces or whatever it is we wrote for the remarkable creation by the Southern Poverty Law Center called Teaching Hard History. His PhD at Duke, and he's a graduate of Morehouse College, and I know Morehouse men love to have that mentioned. My old friend Donald Yakovone is an associate at the Hutchins Center of African American Research at Harvard. Donald has had a remarkable career in public history, in libraries, particularly earlier at the Massachusetts Historical Society, at various times working with the National Park Service. He did his PhD at Claremont University. He was one of the founders and creators, no doubt you've used the collection of the Black Abolitionist Papers Project, which when I came into this business was like Bibles. You had to get those 3 or 4 volumes, or were there 5? I forget. 5 total. 5 total, okay, yeah, I still have them, I know. Yeah? Oh, I still have them, use them all the time. I'm among his, and he created, planned, and edited the remarkable book about the Shaw Memorial in Boston, a conference that took place in 1997 at the 100th anniversary of that great monument, and edited the book that came out of that. He's written on Black soldiers in the Civil War. But most recently, I have to bring mine up here. When this book came out and Donald asked me to blurb it, I immediately emailed him and said, "You're coming to our conference." I think it was a question, but you said yes. The book is Teaching White Supremacy, America's Democratic Ordeal and the Forging of Our National Identity. It is a book all about textbooks, which may not sound sexy, but man, is it interesting. Good cover, right. But the research, and that's the last I'll say, the research, and I'll let him tell you about it, comes from this extraordinary collection of textbooks at the Harvard Ed School. which I've actually worked with before. It's like this giant room full of old textbooks, which doesn't sound exciting until you dive in. Johann Neem is professor and chair of history at Western Washington University. And Johann, thank you for saying yes and coming so far. He's a historian of the early American Republic. He's the editor of the Journal of the Early Republic, a very important journal. It was founded way back when I was like a kid and is still going strong. He's co-edited with my colleague Joanne Freeman a book called Jeffersonians in Power. His recent book, What's the Point of College? Tries to answer that question. What is the point of college? But before that, and the book that he may speak from here, I don't know, is called Democracy Schools, The Rise of Public Education in America, an early history of the rise of public education. And even before that, he wrote a book called Creating a Nation of Joiners. He does BA at Brown, PhD at the University of Virginia, and as I said, now teaches at Western Washington University. And finally, our fourth speaker, who will be with us online, on Zoom, on the screen, is Gloria Ladson-Billings. She's the former Kellner Family Distinguished Chair of Urban Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one of my alma maters. Here's to Lake Mendota. She's on all sorts of boards and institutes about education, including being past president of the National Academy of Education. She's the author of Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, and the book called Crossing Over Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms. And she has a book out now called Critical Race Theory, A Scholar's Journey, which is, I don't know, something like 100 journal articles and book chapters. It's like The Reader on CRT, the real CRT. Will the real CRT please stand up? Any rate, this is an extraordinary group of people to bring together. They each get about 10 to 15 minutes. We have timers up here with orange and yellow cards to keep them on time. And I'll scream at them if I have to. But we're going to go in the order of Johann first, then Donald, then Kwame, then Gloria. Okay? And there's some logic to that. You okay, Daniel? Okay. When Daniel looks at me, I stop. All right. Johann, thank you.
Well, thank you everyone who's here, and thank you to the Gilded Lemon Center for having me out. I'm excited to be part of this panel, What's Race Got to Do with It? I want to start with a fact that's in the opening of my book, Democracy Schools. My book is about the development of public education between the American Revolution and the Civil War, but I point out to readers that Black and white school enrollment did not equalize until around 1970, well after the period of my book. This reflects, of course, the long-standing impact of racism in American life, which meant that Black families had fewer access to educational resources than most white Americans. I don't need to tell you that this was because our public schools have been segregated in fact or law for much of their history, and worse, they are more segregated today than they were a couple decades ago. Now the question is, what relationship does this fact from 1970 have to do with the question I was posing myself when I set out to write a history of public education between the American Revolution and the Civil War much earlier? Or to answer the title of this panel, what's race got to do with the history of American education? And honestly, that was not an easy question for me to answer. I wrote my book because I wanted to revitalize the original purposes and aspirations that convinced Americans to turn education from a private good and a parental responsibility, as it was understood at the time of the Revolution, into a public good and taxpayer and citizen responsibility, as it had come to be understood by the 1830s and 1840s. And that was the primary question that I posed myself, because I was afraid that many of our most high-profile educational reforms, embraced by both parties, risked making education once again a private good. This included not only the unjustifiable inequalities between rich and poor public school districts, but racial segregation, proposals for school choice and vouchers, the parental rights movement, the decline of civic language in our discussions of education, and the increasing unwillingness by those on the cultural left as well as those on the religious right to embrace public schools' traditional mission of socialization, of how to bring a diverse people to come together as Americans, a problem that came up in the prior panel. And we also forget how fragile our public institutions, including our schools, are. Or at least I thought we had forgotten. I think we have become increasingly aware of how fragile all of our public institutions and how contingent they are. We can't take them for granted. So what about race? Here I had to decide whether racism was a feature or a bug. And by this I mean whether American racism, white supremacy, was an essential component to explaining the emergence of common schools or not. Put differently, would there have been a common schools movement absent racism? And the answer I decided, and I'll come back to this in a minute, and why I think this answer matters to all of us today. The answer I decided was yes, that there would have been a common schools movement. While the common schools were racist, and I'll talk about that, as were most Americans at the time, maintaining racial supremacy was not one of the primary reasons why public schools emerged after the revolution. The primary reasons, and I think these reasons matter to all of us today, was educating citizens, encouraging every individual's, although not every individual's, right, talents, equalizing opportunity, and forging a nation. Moreover, the public schools expanded, not just because of abstract ideas expressed by a Jefferson or a Horace Mann or someone like that, but because the institutions themselves proved to parents that they were good and important. In other words, schools proved themselves on the ground, and parents invested because they saw the advantages to their children. But in that investment, they also invested in other people's children. So the schools actually won the argument by being really good. But race and racism did shape who had access to public education and on what terms. And as I was writing my book, I believed it essential that Americans also know that the racial inequalities of our public schools were there from the very beginning. So let me turn now to how race mattered. On the eve of the Civil War, 28% of Black children were in school in New York State, 38% in Pennsylvania, and 40% in Ohio, well below the numbers for white children. In the entire South, on the other hand, only about 3% of free Black children were enrolled. In the North, there was a checkerboard of approaches to the race question. There were to start integrated public schools, especially in rural areas and small towns, where you had fewer Black children and also fewer resources. And as a historian of education, Gabriel Baumgartner has written, segregation and integration practices were hyper-local, which is why it's hard to tell a shared story. They were different not only between schools within the same districts, but they changed within schools themselves over time. Yet the big story is that northern schools were largely segregated and most tax dollars went to support white education, leaving Black Americans behind. Black Americans pushed for tax refunds so that they could use that money to support their own schools, and many jurisdictions actually agreed. But most of the funding went to support white children. African Americans responded in multiple ways. First, they started their own schools or patronized academies that would accept Black students because Black parents and children were deeply committed to education. But second, and most importantly, Black Americans sought integration. For African Americans, access to public schools was evidence not only that was needed, not only because it provided opportunity for their children, but it was evidence that you belonged to the nation, that you were an equal citizen among others. One of the most famous examples of this is Black abolitionist Benjamin Roberts, who sued Boston to mandate racial integration. Roberts and his Black and white allies took the case all the way to the state Supreme Court in 1850, but they did not win the case. They lost. But they didn't give up, and they continued to mobilize and convince the state legislature to outlaw racial segregation in Massachusetts schools. When they had asked the city of Boston to integrate, one of the arguments, and it was rejected, the minority who supported integration wrote this about the value of integration. Our common school system suits our institutions, promotes the feelings of brotherhood and the habits of Republican equality. By being together, equality is promoted. To debar the colored race from these advantages, even if we still secure to them equal education results, is a sore injustice and wrong, and is taking the surest means of perpetuating a prejudice. It is vital that diverse Americans come into the same buildings and spend time together and learn about each other as equals. Now, not every Black Bostonian agreed. Many felt that America was too racist a society to ever treat Black and white students equally within the same buildings. But Roberts had a different understanding of America. Public education, the nation itself, could belong to all Americans. It was essential that Black and white Americans, therefore, indeed all Americans, because this was also an age of increasing immigration, be educated in common institutions, forge mutual respect, as well as a common shared national identity. And white Americans realized this, which may be why they responded with violence at the prospect of integration. Too many whites did not want a multiracial nation. In Canaan, New Hampshire, for example, in 1835, a mob of white people used 95 yoke of oxen to drag Noyes Academy, a private school that educated Black students, into a swamp, and it was not an isolated incident. Now, the story in the South is both simpler and more complex. Simpler in the sense that it goes without saying that white Southerners did not permit enslaved people to be educated officially. Many states banned teaching enslaved people to read, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. But enslaved and free Black people in the South risked much to learn. In cities, there was a whole host of covert schools. And in Mississippi, one observer recalled there were pit schools near a Mississippi plantation where enslaved people would dig a hole in the ground, cover it with brush, a hidden place for enslaved people to learn how to read. That's how much education was valued by those denied it. But the more complex part is that slavery shaped the entire political system of the South. It affected the delivery of all public goods, including education. Because the South's tax system depended on taxing slave owners, and because slave owners dominated the state houses, it was hard even for working and middle-class whites to raise the kinds of taxes that they wanted to support public schools. And there was so the skewing of inequality shaped access to public goods in the South. The inequality of wealth. But there was another issue that frightened slaveholders. If education was what it mattered to develop competent, capable, virtuous citizens, could that matter more than race? In other words, public education was so radical because it threatened the very foundations of the South's racial order. This can explain why, according to a recent article by the historian Campbell Scribner, at least 631 African-American schools were destroyed by violence between 1864 and 1876. And Scribner calls this a baseline because that's what he found in the Freedmen's Bureau records, suggesting that that's only what made it into the records. Now, in the long run, disparate access to public schooling in all regions of the country reinforced America's racial inequalities. A significant legacy of American education was that white skin comes to be associated with full membership in the nation, a cycle yet to be fully broken. But yet, from the very earliest days of the Republic, Black parents have sought to educate their children, and those children have risked violence to get an education. And from the earliest decades of public education in America, public schools both reflected American presumptions of white supremacy and reinforced them. In other words, I try to make clear in my book that the public schools are not innocent institutions in the story of American racial hierarchy, in a story of American racism. By denying Black Americans access to the same schools, the public schools sent the message that Black Americans were not fully American. Now let me return to my initial question. Does knowing this history mean that the major story we need to tell about America's educational history is about race? That's the question of this panel. Does it matter, as we tell complex stories of our past, that most of the advocates of public school were civic egalitarians, albeit not egalitarian always on the case of race, and that public schools sought to purposely replace private tuition with public dollars. Does it matter that our common schools democratized access to a liberal education that had once been the preserve of the elite? And at a time when privatization is on the table, in fact, is taking place in some states, does it not matter that popular support for education as a public good depends on the development of common institutions? Let me repeat that, because I think it's really important. What I found was popular support for public education was a product of the expansion of public education, not the product of some nice words said by nice people. It was actually proving themselves on the ground and delivering public goods that convinced parents to buy into it. What happens if we stop doing that to that ideal of a public good? Can we tell multiple stories of institutions that are both shaped by and contribute to America's racist history? I think we can. I think we must, but I struggle with this question a lot. I tried to tell the truth as best I could grasp it in my book, to be honest about the role of race and racism, while not reducing the story of American public education to it. Should I have made my book primarily about the racist history of public education? I don't know. But if I did, would we have these other stories that we need to try to think about the value, purposes, and also the strategies to maintain and strengthen public education today? I share my thoughts about writing democracy schools because I think they go to the core question posed not just at this panel, but by this conference. In a racist society, it is easy, perhaps too easy, to flip the racist script and see race and racism as the primary cause and foundation for every American idea, policy, and institution. Because racism is honestly everywhere. That's why the big question I think all educators, including me, when I go in to teach the survey on American history or to teach a course on the American Revolution, we all face is when we decide to teach about a subject in the American past or write about a subject in the American past, any subject, whatever it is, how do we know when race and racism is the baby, and how do we know when it's the bathwater? Because the racist bathwater is all around us. I don't know. Honestly, I don't. I'm struggling with this question in my heart, in my mind, all the time, and my answer changes every time I teach, every time I go to a different conference, every time I read something else. But I know that's what we're debating publicly about teaching race and slavery in American classrooms. Some on the left, and we have to admit this, see racism as the constitutive fact of American history. It's always the baby. Conservatives are not wrong when they point this out. They're also not wrong to worry if the left's narrative is correct, that everything else in American history is too corrupt to be salvaged, much less celebrated. There is, in fact, no usable past available for causes progressive or conservative. Now, to be clear, we must condemn the Republicans' overreach, laws that aim to silence asking hard questions about America's racist past, laws that are actually hateful. But we must remember that the institutions of the past are not pure, and purity cannot be our standard, and that is true for both the right and the left. Wholesale acceptance and wholesale rejection are flip sides of the same coin. They simplify complex histories of people who are complex people with multiple motives. They create stereotypes, and we should not do that. And it's not useful, I would argue, to do that either. So I raise it to you as a question, one I struggle with in my book, one I'm dealing with, grappling with every day I walk into a classroom. What's race got to do with it? It's a question that everyone here and everyone listening will have to grapple with when they enter any classroom to teach any subject in American history. Right now, I believe in some kind of moderation. We must work against those who deny the centrality of racism to American history, while also avoiding the temptation to make racism the most salient and only feature or the primary feature of every story we tell about the American past. I can see the temptation. Why? We want to wrong our country's most serious injustice. But it simplifies, and I also worry, given our current moment, it does not help. And it does not help even in the case of where there are resources in our past to achieve goals that might be shared by those on the left. In other words, given our current moment, I don't know, honestly, a better way. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And David, thank you for inviting me to do this. First of all, I want to, before I launch into my more formal remarks, I want to say that before I started writing this book, I was actually engaged in a separate project, a different project rather. I was interested in the legacy of the anti-slavery movement, public memory, and the creation of the modern civil rights movement. But after reading through 55 boxes of manuscripts, I decided I needed a break, and I went over to the Graduate School of Education's Monroe C. Gutman Library and was confronted with 3,000 US history textbooks. And I was astonished and devastated by this. But as I started reading through them, something came over me. Now, I know the historiography of race and slavery and abolitionism, but the fact that I was reading, what I was reading in textbooks from 1832 to the 1980s, and that these books were aimed specifically at children, washed over me. I abandoned my project and I wrote this book instead. And if it were not for that collection of textbooks and tens of thousands of other books and pamphlets, this couldn't have happened. And I was devastated and shocked when I learned about a year ago that the Harvard Graduate School of Education took that whole collection and removed it from the library and stuck it in a warehouse. Yes.
It used to have its own room.
That room was turned over to the administrators so they could have conferences like this and have teachers come in and make money. How could I have written this book without having access to books? To know, yes, they're in the card catalog, but what do you know what to search for? They were gone. And they're still gone. The librarians there, the wonderful librarians there, were devastated at what happened. However, there is still officially a special collections department, and they're still doing their work, but the collection's in a warehouse. The fabled 1873 lithograph, variously titled American Progress or Manifest Destiny by the New York publisher and Western travel promoter George A. Crofut, exalts the divine mission of the United States to expand across the continent. It's the cover of my book. The illustration's alluring figure of Columbia with the Star of Empire on her forehead floats across the landscape, sweeping away indigenous peoples and the wilderness for the expansion of American farms, cities, and railroads. Her left hand clutches a telegraph line, the internet of the 19th century, and her right hand cradles not the Bible or a digest of laws, but as Crofut himself wrote, the emblem of education, the school book. Never before or since has any American more graphically unified national identity with white supremacy and education. Traditionally, scholarship and popular thought have blamed the legacy of Southern slavery and Jim Crow segregation for the distressing persistence of racial inequality. And of course, Southern slave owners and the descendants do possess a unique and lethal responsibility for racial repression and civil war. But even if slaves had never existed in the South, Northern white theorists, religious leaders, intellectuals, writers, politicians, scientists, lawyers, and especially educators would have invented a lesser race, which is exactly what happened, to build white democratic solidarity, and in that way, make democratic culture and political institutions possible. As the novelist Toni Morrison once explained, in the United States, the rights of man, quote, was inevitably yoked to Africanism. In other words, American democracy depended upon Black inequality to sustain white equality. American educators played a critical role in sustaining white supremacy. James Baldwin, the celebrated African-American author and critic, recalled in 1965 that, quote, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history and that neither had I. I was a savage about whom the least said the better, who had been saved by Europe and who had been brought to America. This was, his education taught him, an act of God. You belonged where white people put you. And it always has been so. In the 1920s, if an African-American student had asked a teacher why no Black people appeared in his history textbook, and they didn't, the answer would be that African-Americans, quote, had done nothing to merit inclusion. As the Black scholar Charles H. Wesley reported in 1925, through textbooks and classroom instruction, the Black student quickly realized that his badge of color in America is a sign of subjugation, inferiority, and contempt. In 1939, the NAACP surveyed popular American history textbooks, and as one Black student concluded from the association's findings, since textbooks drilled white supremacy into the minds of growing children, I see how hate and disgust is motivated against the American Negro. Textbooks, as I discovered, became cultural syringes that injected these poisons directly into the minds of American students, Black and white. In part, we are right to see history textbooks as prayer books of our national civil religion, as engines of democracy and equality, far from mere aggregations of dead facts. History texts serve as reservoirs of values, patriotism, and national ethos, which we proudly treasure in our republic. In particular, history textbooks sought to create unity through storytelling, creating a national identity that could serve as a roadmap to the future, as training for citizenship in the broadest sense. But what was the nature of that unity they aimed to create? Thomas Maitland Marshall's 1930 textbook embodied the ideals, assumptions, and aims that characterized nearly all History American textbooks published before the 1960s. The very first page of his book shrieks in capital letters, "The story of the white man." As so many other 20th century textbooks inculcated, Marshall taught that, quote, and this is in the textbook, the Negro of plantation days was usually happy. He was fond of the company of others and liked to dance, sing, dance, crack jokes, and laugh. He admired bright colors and was proud to wear a red or orange bandana. He was never in a hurry. He was always ready to let things go until the morrow. Most planters, he asserted, learned that loyalty based on pride, kindness, and rewards, like wine, he didn't say that, another book did, not the whip, brought the best returns. And that's not the worst of the things that I found. At the advent of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of American textbooks began with Marshall's assumption that the history of the United States was the history of the white man, his struggles against Native Americans, which were usually rendered as red savages, and his need to control the lives of African Americans. As a 1918 text explained to students, whatever non-English people had done to create the United States, quote, and this is in italics, the forces that have shaped that life have been English. In 1856, Emerson had proclaimed that so-called truth in his book, English Traits. The nation had a fixed identity, authors asserted, one inherited exclusively from Great Britain. Most textbooks variously presented African Americans as a foreign, repellent element, an unwanted presence, a necessary evil, or a threat, and always, as one 1914 textbook asserted, quote, a problem that it took many years to solve. How would they solve that problem? Well, into the 1960s, scholars and textbooks they produced insisted that anything beyond vocational training for African Americans was a waste of time. They taught children, quote, that Negroes were unfit to rule. It had been a terrible mistake, textbooks proclaimed, to prevent the intelligent white people from governing after the Civil War. Authors assured readers that, quote, men of intelligence and property will not submit to the rule of the ignorant very long. And of course, by ignorant, they meant African Americans. As Professor Marshall had concluded, quote, white robes and fiery crosses had the desired results. Well, today, the worst features of our textbooks have been eliminated. The problem that James Baldwin had identified in the 1960s remains. Teachers from Florida to Vermont and west to Washington staged damaging slave auctions in their classrooms, what one Black Vermont parent rightly labeled curricular violence. The influential New York Times journalist Charles Blow explained that when he was young, I was led to believe Blackness was inferior. We had been trained in it, bathed in it, acculturated to hate ourselves. At every turn, at every moment, I was being baptized in the narrative that everything white was right, good, noble, and beautiful, and everything Black was not. The bitter influence lay everywhere, he wrote, even in the blue-eyed white Jesus hanging over your bed. The experience of Black high school students in my own Boston suburb in 2020 reinforced Blow's account. A local branch of the NAACP, along with students, protested school curriculum and the punishments handed out to African American students. I am not going to lie, one of the female students explained. Going to high school made me hate being Black. Despite the monumental outburst of thoughtful and determined scholarship since the mid-1960s, the way we teach history in the public schools remains as lifeless as John Brown's body. But clearly, slavery and race, Professor Jeffries wrote, isn't in the past. It's in the headlines. However taught in schools, history is far from a dead thing. We carry it with us, James Baldwin memorably remarked in his essay, The White Man's Guilt. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to our history that we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. Thank you.
very much, and good afternoon and good morning. I want to start with my students. I teach some wonderful students at The Ohio State University, and I'm duty bound now to say "the" because it's been trademarked by The Ohio State University. And when I teach about the civil rights movement, I always at some point ask my students, after the Supreme Court rules in 1954 that segregation in education is unconstitutional, I ask them simply, when did schools in the South desegregate? How long after the court ruled did schools desegregate? And we'll begin to go around the room. And the students invariably will say, immediately? The start of the next school year? And one or two may, like, wait a minute, let's see, I still go to a segregated school, high school, so maybe not. But they're always saying in the immediate aftermath. And you look back now and you're like, man, why on earth would they think that? Thurgood Marshall himself, when asked, how long would it take for this ruling to be implemented? He said, 2 years, maybe. We know that it didn't. The immediate response to the Supreme Court's ruling in 54 and then in 55, of course, was to double down on in the white South. Massive resistance. 10 years after the Supreme Court rules that segregation in education is unconstitutional, nearly all Black children in the South still attended all Black schools. Nearly all white children in the South still attended all white schools. 10 years, a full decade. But then something happens in 1965. In 1965, as a part of the emerging war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson gets passed through Congress the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We talk about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we talk about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we don't talk enough about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, because what that does is sets aside a couple $2 billion for school districts that were under-resourced. School districts in the South, rural school districts in the South, urban school districts, but really rural school districts, formerly segregated school districts in the South. It sets aside a couple $1 billion for them to access. But the only way they could access this money is if they desegregated. It's that pot of money, dangling that pot of money, that actually triggers desegregation in the South. But something also happens in this moment as well. When school boards, looking at this money in under-resourced rural communities in Alabama and in Mississippi and Louisiana and in the Carolinas, when school board officials look at this and say, look, we can't pass this up, right? We have to access this. What they then do, starting in 1965, is they propose desegregation plans. Now, they're not serious about desegregating, right? I mean, this is pupil transfer plans, and we know a series of measures designed to delay actual desegregation. But they have to come up with something. So on paper, they're saying we will desegregate. And in 65 and 66 and 67, you will find a number of these school districts will actually accept 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, just a handful of African Americans to attend formerly all-white public schools. But just the idea that Black children would attend schools with white children, even in small numbers, was enough for white Southerners to say, hell no. And so what we see being brought about in 1965, 10 years after the Brown decision, is a split in white solidarity when it comes to public education. Because once those school boards say, we're going to open the door, just even if it's just a crack, that becomes too much for many white parents, for many white Southerners. And so what we see then in response to token desegregation in 65, 66, and 67 is the creation of private white academies. This is when they are born. You have a handful of military schools dotted throughout the landscape in the South, but white folk were fully on board with public education at this moment in time, mid-century. But once that door is open, then suddenly we see the emergence of these private white academies. And they're, typically named after the local, the county and whatever it would be, but they're segregationist academies. And the people are clear about their purpose. I mean, the good thing about doing archival research and looking back at the time is white folk weren't afraid to say that they were white supremacists. They were like, I'm like, oh yeah, thank you very much. I mean, you don't gotta make anything up. They're saying we are creating these private white schools because we don't want our children to go to school with black children. And they're calling them segregationist academies. But there's something that they found out, they discovered really quick, that creating a school is expensive. And so from the very beginning, two things happen. One, they begin to siphon off public education dollars and resources through local school boards. So we hear the stories of selling, literal school buildings to private white foundations to establish segregation of schools for $1, right? That begins. But we also see starting a decades-long effort to get public dollars to support private education. And immediately, the courts are like, no, right? Like, that's not going to fly, right? Especially when you are discriminating because you're literally saying you're not allowing black children to attend these schools. By the time we get to the 1970s, segregationist schools, segregationist academies began to rebrand. They began to rebrand. So we've established already a new dual education system within a decade. We've moved from a segregated dual education system that was within the public sphere to now a segregated education system that was private and public. The rebrand occurs in the early 1970s when these segregationist academies become Christian academies. The Christian academies that will dot the landscape, that are still with us today, especially in the South, that then will spawn these cousins outside of the South, have their roots in these segregationist academies. That's what they were. The 1970s creates this rebrand. And then we see moving into the 1980s, and then certainly into the 1990s, and even now, trying to find public dollars for these Christian academies. That will give us block grants. That will give us charter schools. That will give us this effort to find public dollars to promote, to support, to expand segregationist schools. So what does race have to do with the way we have structured our educational system today, and certainly over the last 50 years? Absolutely everything. So we have a structure in place, and so much of our politics today revolves around still trying to find, siphoning off public dollars to support charter schools, which are Christian academies, to segregationist academies. To this day, we're still fighting that balance. Supreme Court just ruled in case just up the road about creating access funding for schools, allowing funding for schools that desegregate. I mean, that segregate, that discriminate. So that battle is still going on. So on the one hand, I know I only got a couple more minutes left. On the one hand, we have a educational structure that is rooted in racism. Could it be possible then within that to create an anti-racist educational experience? No. Why on earth would we think that that is even the goal if we're pretending as though the system itself isn't rooted in inequality? And all we have to do is look at the curriculum and the intent. So put that to the side for a second, because there's something that I forgot to mention that I think is really critical in this, and that is, where have Black folk been in this, right? Because in 1965, when we begin to see that effort, when actual desegregation becomes possible, because Black folk in the South, when Brown is passed, like, what is their reaction? They're like, oh, that's interesting. They know ain't nothing gonna change. They know these white folk down here, right, with that history of racial violence against their schools. They're like, okay, good luck. We appreciate that. There's nothing gonna change here. But when when it actually becomes possible that schools could be desegregated, right? Not fully integrated, desegregated, most Black parents are like, good. Ain't no way in hell I'm sending my children to these white schools to be taught by these white teachers. Why? Because these are the same white folk that have been killing them, exploiting them. Like, I'm not sending my children. Like, are you crazy? There's only a handful, right? That first generation of Black children and Black parents, I mean, my God, what they suffered and what they went through. Most Black parents are like, absolutely not. I am not sending my child into that environment. Why? Because the goal for Black folk during the Civil Rights Movement was not to send their children to be sitting next to white children. Like, when we look back at the Civil Rights, particularly around public education, we look back and think the goal of the movement, the goal was not educational equality, but rather proximity to whiteness. Like, that's what Black people were striving for. We run around acting like little white kids are magic. At the Ohio State, I teach a lot of white kids. Ain't nothing magical about white children. Other than, of course, their ability to attract public resources wherever they go. Black folk understood this. They are making a political calculation, right? Because at first they're like, just give us the resources that we need so we can teach our own children. We love our teachers. We love our administrators. We're not happy with this resource allocation. If you provide us with what we need, then we can teach how we want to teach. We can teach the truth. There is no conflict around critical race theory in majority Black schools. There's no concern about divisive issues in majority Black schools. They're teaching the truth. This is white people conflicted about this stuff in suburban and rural schools. And this has always been the case. Black folk have not had a problem with the truth. But coming out of the civil rights era, there's a dilemma. The resources are not being shared equitably. And so therefore sacrifices have to be made. And that's when Black parents begin to send their children to these formerly desegregated, formerly all white schools. And at the same time as we have formerly Black schools being underfunded, defunded, and the like. So you almost don't have a choice. And this last point, then I'll sit down, because there's a whole lot of movement going on right now. There is a moment in the 1970s, as was pointed out earlier, we are actually now more segregated today than we were in the 1970s when we look at public education and sort of our students. Why? Because in the 1970s and 1980s, what we actually saw, and most scholars will agree that this is the height of school integration, right, in terms of sheer numbers. But that was actually what I call transitional desegregation. We were transitioning, still transitioning out of a public education system that was losing white folk in communities where African Americans were now enrolling in formerly all white schools. To say nothing about what was happening in urban communities in which suburbs were expanding. And so we've never really had a truly integrated, racially integrated public education system. We've had these transitional moments. And so I think we got to reconcile with that. Just like we have very few desegregated, racially integrated neighborhoods. We have transitional neighborhoods. They transition from being the hood to Starbucks. White folk coming in. And we look at these numbers and be like, oh yes, Brooklyn is wonderfully desegregated. No, it's not, it's transitioning. It's about to be all white. And we've done the same thing with education. And so I think when we're thinking about that question, what does racism have to do with it? It's in our DNA as a nation. It may not be the driving motivation, but it's there. And we can't solve the problem of it unless and until we confront that aspect head on. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I am happy to join you. Sorry not to be with you. Actually, sorry, not sorry, because I'm actually in Cancun at another conference. But I am delighted to be a part of this panel. Also, I think it's really interesting that David started the first panel, which was amazing, with a reading from the Constitution. And yes, I actually have a Constitution with me. I'm one of those weird people who carries her Constitution. And I think there's an interesting quote in this version that I have, where they're quoting some statements of George Washington. And here's one from 1796, where he says, the primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important, and what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country? So the very nature of education in a democracy is so important. And I want to make sure I put my timer on because I can't see the little orange card. So I do have a timer. But I'm glad to come in this sequence of speakers because we've heard about ideology, we've heard about history, we've heard about the structure, and I want to talk as a sort of curriculum specialist about what actually goes on when we think about what is it we're going to teach young people. So to keep me from rambling, I am going to share my screen. I have just 3 or 4 slides, so don't get nervous. And let's see if I can get there. Okay, so the first point I just want to make is that there have always been contested views of history. I give you some examples here. Of course, there is Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, which is a very different view of Reconstruction than sort of what we think of as mainstream. I placed the example of Benjamin Quarles, who I had the pleasure of being his advisee as an undergraduate. Quarles, of course, is a contemporary and dear friend of John Hope Franklin, who talked about the Negro in the American Revolution. And then you had Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, which became D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, that Woodrow Wilson, himself a historian, claimed was like the finger of God writing history. Now, all of you who have seen The Birth of a Nation know that that's a very distorted view of what American history was all about. One of the pieces of my background that David Blight didn't share is that I began my career as a social studies teacher, social studies history teacher in the school district of Philadelphia. I am a Philadelphian. So you know how steeped we are in places like Independence Hall and Founding Fathers. And in fact, I tried to get a job once as the museum teacher because that's kind of the raison d'etre of teaching history in a place like Philadelphia. But I want to point out very quickly that curriculum debate's not new. We think that, oh, okay, this divisive thing is going on right now is the issue, but this has been the way in which schooling in America has essentially unfolded. So what we know is we can go back to the Scopes trial. You know, the whole question of evolution, that was a very contested debate. In World War II, what we saw were removal of books from libraries. If they were written by a German author, they had to come off the library shelves. During the Cold War and McCarthyism, you had the banning of books that were thought to be anti-American or pro-communist. They had over 30,000 books banned during that time. You know, often we try to teach book banning as something they do in those other countries, but no, we've done it, and we've done it a lot. In the 1960s, something called the MACOS, the Man of Course of Study controversy arrived in Phoenix that essentially tanked a whole series of curricular reform because it was thought to be teaching in some ways, kind of circling back to the Scopes trial, that human beings weren't special. In the 1980s, some of you will remember that the then Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, had claimed that first, that the federal government should have nothing to do with local schools and their curriculum. However, in that same era, Bennett shows up at Stanford because Stanford was making a change in its Western Civ requirement. They were changing it to something they called CIV, or culture, ideas, and values. It was an expansion of Western Civ. It didn't remove any of the traditional books that we saw in Western civilization. It added Toni Morrison, it added James Baldwin or Langston Hughes, and Bennett, while he said that we shouldn't have anything to do with public school curriculum, is at a private university arguing that they shouldn't change their curriculum. So we've had these curriculum debates. It was really good to hear about the textbook collection, and very sorry to hear that Harvard Graduate School has archived it in a warehouse. Because in the 1990s, we had the California versus New York history social science framework debates. New York opted for something it called the kind of multicultural perspective on history and social science. California claimed to be doing it, but it was a very sort of narrow conception of the contributions and the inclusion of diverse perspectives. As a result, there was a contentious textbook war. I had the dishonor, I think, of being on the instructional materials evaluation panel. One of the things that you need to know about US history, or US textbooks in general, is that half of the states in this nation are what we call adoption states. In other words, somebody at the state level helps to determine what the books will be. The other half of the country is what's called free territory. And I've worked with textbook companies, and that's a kind of sausage making you really don't want to see. But what happens in these adoption states, two of which are large states, Texas and California. California's adoption from K through grades 8. Texas's adoption K-12. What those two states determine should be in a textbook is what the rest of us get, because they make up 11% of the market. So you have the market that is fueling this whole thing. And there were just statements and omissions and distortions in the books that were being used for the California series that was sort of sending people over the edge. It ended up with some states, some districts like Oakland, San Francisco, and LA, opting not to purchase the book. So their kids went without textbooks because they felt that so many parts of these books were indeed demeaning. In 1998, of course, we had the California Proposition 227, which essentially said we're not having bilingual education. which was a huge turn from a Supreme Court decision that had come down in 1974, which was a Loud decision. So here is a quote, citizens revolt against bilingual education. And then, of course, here we are today talking about the 1619 versus 1776 project. So we have always had these curriculum debates, and today's challenges to teaching about race and injustice really reflect what I would call old wine in new wineskins. This graphic that you see essentially is a mock-up of the US, and the buff-colored states are all the states in which things like teaching about race, teaching about racism, certainly teaching about critical race theory, teaching about slavery are being challenged or banned. Now, there haven't been full bans in all of them. As someone who was a resident of Wisconsin, I know that the legislature has passed it. The governor has vetoed it. Depending on what happens next Tuesday, it'll go through, or he may no longer have a veto-proof legislature. So this is part of the landscape, and I'm gonna come right out of these slides. I just wanted to lay those out there for you to kind of suggest what we're dealing with overall. I was very struck also by Professor Jeffries' point about Black people not really feeling like the only thing they could do is have access to schools with white children. If you go back and read the original cases that comprise the Brown decision, the Bueller v. Gephardt ones in Delaware, the Briggs case in South Carolina, what people were asking for were things like equal transportation opportunity to their segregated school. You know, how it became full school desegregation is really less about schools and more about Cold War policy and the image of America in its defense of fighting against the Soviets. So I think it's really important for us to understand that we've been doing this a long time. I was, hearing Professor Jeffries talk about these academies. You know, I've studied some of these academies. It's interesting because, they take names like the Jefferson Davis Academy. I mean, like, can you tell me any clearer what you're after? The Robert E. Lee Academy. So I think this tension that we constantly have between the place of race and racism, not only in how we structure schools, but what we decide to teach in schools is important. I also want to make a point in the minute that I have left that there was a question that came up in the first panel in which a teacher said that they had a student who denied the very reality of slavery. And, what do I do with that? And the first thing that came to my mind is whether or not your students have been also given access to the Confederate Constitution, because they did develop a constitution. And in that constitution, they explicitly say, hey, you can't ban slavery. If you're in the Confederacy, you can't ban it. So there it is in black and white, that slavery was something that we believed in. And the 3/5 notion is written, it ended up getting taken out of the original. It's in the Confederate Constitution. So using these primary sources, I think Professor Jeffries said it right. People write stuff down. So you can't deny it. I mean, if you want to talk about the difference between the way black and white people function, I always say if Richard Nixon had been black, there would have been no tapes, because we don't tape nothing, right? But there's a the beauty of the history is that you can find it. It's documented. And I just see my timer went off, so I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, Gloria. And let me be the first to say, I love your glasses, man. And for that wonderful little chronology of how there's nothing new about this particular history war, curriculum war. I still remember a letter I once wrote to Bill Bennett. I was bitching about something. I don't know what it was, but I got a letter back. Told me to get lost. I want to ask the first question, and then we'll turn it right over to the audience. I'd like to get Johan, you in dialogue here with Kwame, Gloria, and Donald. And I'm not setting you up here. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. But you made an appeal, and I thought an eloquent appeal for not your baby in bathwater metaphor. It's very useful. Throw out everything that developed about public schools because of the racism at their roots. That's not a simple argument to make in this day and age. It's, but it's something we need to. You made an argument for complexity. Not that the rest of you didn't talk about complexity, but I want to hear because to Donald, you painted a picture that is hopelessly racist in these textbooks. Or am I wrong? Not hopeless.
No, not hopelessly, but
Okay.
intended to be.
Intended to be. Okay. And Kwame, you made an amazing, eloquent argument about how desegregation had one stage after another that is not integration and never has been. And Gloria shows us a similar narrative, a similar tale. Donald, Kwame, respond to Johan's point that there are some bathwaters we don't perhaps want to throw out with the baby, or do we? How do we find our feet in that argument? Because I didn't set you guys up. You did this. Johan, you want to go first? Respond to your colleagues here, but then I want to hear them on this too.
Well, here's the thing. Like, the thing I'm not saying is that my colleagues are wrong about the racism.
Right.
I mean, just to be clear, right? What I'm saying is we don't want to reduce the past to that. So here's an example. A teacher colleague who I respect very much once said to me, after I was talking about the Declaration of Independence, I never thought to say anything good about the Declaration. Now, I know most of us wouldn't go there, but that's what a lot of Americans are hearing. And they're hearing, wait, you think that what's become sacred scripture? Sacred scripture, by the way, because Black Americans after the Revolution were the first to see the universal possibilities, and that became part of the abolitionist movement, and it worked its way up to Lincoln. But it wasn't, but that should give us pause then. If that's the case, I never thought to say anything good about the Declaration. I'm an immigrant from India. It meant a lot to me, actually, to say something good about the Declaration. Not because, before 1965, people like me were not allowed to become citizens here. It's because of the civil rights movement and the changes in immigration law that came out of that. But that opened up the country to me. And I think that part of opening up that country is realizing that there's a complex history. But part of that complex history is part of those parts of that country had complex people, that there's lots of parts that became mine too. And so was Horace Mann walking around all the time thinking about white supremacy? No.
Oh, no, he was.
No, he wasn't. I think I'm wrong. I went back and read his letters on slavery after I read your book, and I was like, wait, this is a man who's talking constantly about the moral, political, and intellectual equality of Black people. I mean, of the dignity of all human beings.
He was a colonizationist.
And he also made comments about colonization. But if you look at the essence of what he said, it's about the human equality of Black Americans to white Americans. And so this is the kind of thing. So was he also, when we look back, are we able to find a lot of racist elements in people like that? Yes. And sometimes you have to decide, is that the legacy of all things? Is that the main story of the New Deal? Or is that part of the story of the New Deal, but it's not the main story of the New Deal? Is that the main story of the American Revolution and the Declaration, or is that part of the story, and not the whole story? Can these things become part of all of ours? And do we sometimes risk, when we're on the left, teaching in a way that actually not only alienates the right, but takes it away from the rest of us as well?
Just to, I'm trying to cut off your applause. Gloria, you had that picture up of a Benjamin Quarles book. I must thank you for that. I'm looking up, so Gloria's up here.
Yeah, no, you can keep looking straight ahead.
Okay, in Cancun. Benjamin Quarles was a hero for me and a lot of us in this field. He wrote 8 books. Negro on the Revolution, Negro on the Civil War, Negro on John Brown, and on and on. Incredible work. And he did it from his lonely perch at Morgan State in Baltimore. But it's Ben Quarles who also once said, nobody refused to allow America to de-revolutionize its revolution more than Black Americans, which was his way of saying, Black folk took that Declaration of Independence and made it their own. So just that, I mean, in a big historical sense, your point is well taken. But, you know, Donald, go ahead. You're ready.
I'm ready. Forest man considered Africans, along with Asian peoples, to be like trees of a noble forest that grow in the rocky depths of a cavern without strength or beauty or healing balm, in impurity and darkness. They were little more than unfortunate people fed by poisonous exhalations from stagnant pools. Africans, who we assumed lived under abject despotism, intellectually dwell in a pit denser than the subterranean darkness. As for the institution of slavery, man cared nothing for its victims, but instead fretted, as had Benjamin Franklin, a slave owner, over slavery's impact on whites. Work under the regime of slavery was dishonorable, he argued, something only a slave did. It even affected the country's cherished white women, he warned on the floor of Congress, because he was also a congressman. With shocking language, man informed his fellow congressmen that because slavery tainted the very idea of work, Southern white women refused to, quote, and these are man's words, to join their black sluts in any sort of household labor.
And that is one quote, but I would urge everyone to go read his lectures on slavery, where he also says when we talk about color, what do we mean when we have white people who are darker than black people? What do we mean when we are talking about people who are born to equality but are denied it? What do we mean when we're talking about people whose moral and intellectual capabilities have been environmentally prevented from developing, but are equal to all other peoples? I mean, where is the weight of the evidence? Does that quote exist? Of course. But read the lectures on slavery by Hasan and see where the weight of his argument goes. And that's what I would say.
Kwame, you want to weigh in? Of course. Who says, by the way, we don't have arguments on the left?
I think what we will not find in the 1700s and the 1800s and much of the 1900s is racial enlightenment from even the most enlightened of our framers and founders and deep educational thinkers. Because the air they breathed was white supremacy. So I agree that context is critical. I believe that we have to complicate narratives, but I'm also not, and I know this is not what you're doing, but I'm also not interested in trying to rehabilitate those who in general deny my humanity. And this goes for Thomas Jefferson. We can talk about the Declaration of Independence. This goes for James Madison, political genius to be sure, but also held over 100 people in bondage and never freed a single soul. So my project, and I think it should be all of our projects in teaching this history, should be to make it plain, to lay it out, not so that I'm not interested in putting anybody on a pedestal or knocking them off. I just want to understand who they were. The problem is, this is not a neutral environment. The problem is, we have people cast in stone who we've been celebrating, who we've been pretending that when he wrote all men are created equal actually included Black folk and women, indigenous people. And so now we have to go back and say, no, that's not the case, and explain that to our children. We can't have kids coming into our classrooms in college thinking that, wait a minute, Jefferson actually held people in bondage? You're in college. Now, that's not your fault. But you know what that gives us? That gives us Kanye West. And that's we created that insanity. And so I think you're absolutely right. We gotta complicate, we gotta make it complex, we gotta look at the different layers. But I also think in doing that, we have to be absolutely brutally honest and connected to the ways in which we've talked about this in the past. Because we can't separate that out, because that's still informing so much of what our students and what we think. We have to do with this subject in particular, the slavery or civil rights, certainly with African American history, but with US history, more so than sort of science and some other subjects. We have to do as much unlearning as we do learning. That's critical.
David, can I just jump in here briefly? Can I jump in here briefly? And I think it's interesting that as scholars, we tend to want to be very complex and nuanced, but we are talking to a public also that has no truck with our scholarly books and our articles or any of that kind of stuff. And as having become the poster child for critical race theory and education, I've learned to just ask the simple question of people. And the question is, how do you explain racial disparity? I just want to get a sense of where you think it comes from. And then, of course, if there's someone who says there is none, then we don't even have a conversation because we're living in different universes. But if people will acknowledge that on the issues of education, on health, on employment, on housing, on lending, on all of these things, that there are disparities that can be documented by race, we need an explanation. It's not as if we haven't had one. From 1619 to the mid 20th century, the explanation was biogenetic. We just said those people are just not smart enough. But, Brown would begin to say, well, maybe that's not so. They just don't have equal opportunity. Okay, fine. But when we see equal opportunity roll out, Professor Jeffries pointed out, you have Brown, it takes 10 years to even move a few kids. It always rolls back. The Voting Rights Act rolled back. Civil Rights Act rolled back. What's going to happen with this Supreme Court, with this affirmative act? It's going to get rolled back. So the equal opportunity thesis is probably not as robust as it ought to be. And so for many ways, critical race theory ends up being a place that I land. I tell people all the time, it's not my religion. It is my perception of how we explain disparity. If you give me a better explanation, I'm happy to move to that.
Thanks, Gloria. At this time, Tom, we got an online quote from live streaming world. Go ahead.
Yes, I do. I have one from our colleague Phil Katz.
Yes, at CIC in Washington, D.C. Hi, Phil.
Who asked if any of the panelists would like to address the rise of homeschooling and the recent rise of parental rights, that's in big quotes, as an extension of the histories they've been discussing.
Gloria.
I think it's interesting because among those who are starting to do more homeschooling are Black families. But of course, you would have to be, fluent enough and mobile enough to be able to provide that, which means you're not going to work every single day during the school day. But I think what has happened in schools has always been about the sort of keeping our children away from who we see as the unwashed, the poor, the Black, the Latinx, the immigrant. And it's hidden under the guise of, I have a right as a parent, or I'm the decision making. We're so immersed in this notion of choice. You go back to economist Milton Friedman. He was the one who said there shouldn't be any public schools, that the market should determine, and that you should just give the money to the parents and they should go do what they want to. The problem I have is that we have a misunderstanding, and this is why civics education is important. We have a misunderstanding of the public good. The public good is not just the aggregation of our private goods or our private rights. It is sometimes you don't get what you want for us to have the public good. And I think that's a very difficult concept. The tension between the individual and the collective is a very difficult concept for most Americans to get their heads around.
I heard somebody say amen. Let's take some questions from the audience. Thanks, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been tremendously helpful and really a lot of really important information that we should be sharing with our kids. I'm going to bring it back to the classroom, the U.S. history classroom. My perspective may be a little skewed. I teach outside of the United States in Singapore. We use the C3 standards, the C3 framework in our school. And ever since I've been there, there's been a real struggle of trying to hang on to content. How, the panelists can help me understand this, and maybe my colleagues who are in the US and can talk about how widespread C3 usage, there's no content standards in C3. What are we teaching our kids in our classrooms in the United States and US history if our standards or framework don't specifically mention any content?
So what does C3 stand for if there's no content?
Skills.
Skills, of course, right. So critical thinking, et cetera.
Exactly.
Oh God, the social studies movement. Lost history, right? Comments, anybody? Yeah, John.
I mean, I think one thing we have to think about in the emergence of the standards movement is its own evolution away from subject matter, which I prefer better more than content because it suggests a disciplinary engagement with a rich body of knowledge. And subject matter because we don't agree. The academics tried, the policymakers tried, and you remember the 80s and 90s. The history wars, the English wars, the math wars. After that, they turned it over to the business class. And the business class is no more neutral than we are. And they said we want people with transferable skills. And we couldn't agree on subject matter. We couldn't agree on the content of especially our humanities curriculum. I mean, this is evidence about how much humanities matter in daily life. I mean, we argue over it more than anything else. And so you move to this switch towards skills because you don't agree on content. The catch is you can't think critically, much less share a community without some shared knowledge and some shared facts. And thinking critically is not an abstract thing. It happens through subject matter. And so re-engaging with rich subject matter not only will engage students because students are curious. You know, they want to know things from diverse perspectives. They want to see the world in interesting ways. But it's also vital to this thing we call critical thinking. It doesn't happen without it. And that's what at least what cognitive scientists have been saying. I mean, a lot of you already know that. But I think that's part of the story, that we move to skills out of politics. You know?
Okay, question for the teachers. Show of hands. You had a choice. A day off to read your subject or about new pedagogy skills.
Biased audience.
Yeah.
Just asking. Which would you choose?
Content. That's why we're here.
No, pedagogy.
Pedagogy, fine. Because it's damn hard and you need new ideas.
Because education is a practice, a process of liberation, and so you know how to do that regardless of the content.
Okay, interesting. Did you hear that? His answer was because teaching is about liberation.
Education as a practice. I'm going with,
Education.
again, like routing through bell hooks and vocabulary, like it's not,
Yeah.
Yes, you need content, but
Right.
the application of the skills and the habits of everyday life required for application and emancipation
Okay.
should go outside.
I hope you heard that.
Yeah. And he said that because every one of us has had a brilliant professor who couldn't teach his way out of a wet paper bag.
Yes. We've written 11 books. It's a good read. Right, okay. If I have a rebuttal with that? Yes.
Up here.
Sorry. Oh,
Hey,
Mr. Armstrong.
yeah, I work, don't throw rocks, please. I work at the State
Can
Department.
y'all hear Steve?
Right there.
The live streaming won't hear you if you don't, kiss the mic.
Again, don't throw rocks. I work at the State Department of Ed in Connecticut. But
He's hiding up there.
Yeah, that's right. But we use the C3 as the framework of our standards in Connecticut. And I can assure you that the C3 is not talking about don't do content. The C3 is giving you, and hopefully giving students, a lens, an inquiry lens, that we want students to investigate. And so there should be content, absolutely, but I think the original intent of the C3 is to give that over to the states, what content each state will teach, because as was said here, I think it's virtually impossible to get a national consensus on it.
Right, okay, let's take a couple more, how about right?
If I could just add real quick,
Sure, go ahead.
I've had a chance, I'm so glad, Stephen, that you're here to see in person and reach in person. I've had a chance to review the work in progress for the new standards, and they're pointing to here in Connecticut, it's going to be a model for what the nation should do. I mean, it's not just laying out based upon the C3, but it's pointing to the critical content that we need. And we know as teachers, you don't have enough time to go through all of it, but it's pointing in the right direction. It's saying, so it's really not, it should never be one or the other. It's really a balance of both and they're doing it really marvelously well here in Connecticut.
Boy, that's good to hear. How about right, well, okay, back there first, and then over here. Okay, I am, either way, let's go left and then right.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is quickly anecdotal, but it speaks to this idea of the complicated narrative. With my second graders, and talking about my private institution, which I went to because I had more autonomy, I felt. Public school educated myself. When we talked about the founder of the school, who was a tremendous slaveholder, died in 1873, his name is John McDonough. I could talk to my 7 and 8 year olds about ambivalence. And I could say to them, there are some good things and there are some not so good things.
7-year-olds do ambivalence?
They got
That's
it.
amazing.
Because they know that people are not all one thing or another.
Yeah.
That's not to say that the issues and the reality of the Declaration of Independence, which I also taught them, all men are being created equal, and at the same time talking to them that meant white property owning men. So I felt I could talk to them truthfully about what the facts were, while also trying to lift up what was positive, but never denying the reality of the systemic racism that we were all a part of. I would just be curious to know whether you think that's an applicable thought, ambivalence, so we don't have such polarization about good and bad, sexual orientation, so many issues that our country is confronted with. If we could acknowledge the ambiguity is another word.
I tell my students every day, ambiguity makes the world go.
Ambiguity, that was my word.
Of course I believe that. I mean, we have to.
Or contradiction.
We have to teach about ambiguity, we have to teach about hypocrisy, we have to teach about the fact that human beings are also non-hypocritical, contradictory. You know, we're complex, and so is our history. And I think I agree, I know people do that as well.
But we can't, but for too long, one of the ways in which we respond to hard history, to difficult subjects, is an attempt to rationalize evil. And too often, what we've fallen back on are these attempts to rationalize things. Like, well, all people did that, they look good. So I'm saying we have to be careful because some stuff just is wrong. And I'm not afraid, and we shouldn't be afraid to say owning people, buying and selling people is just wrong. That's not a 21st century perspective. perspective, you have Thomas Jefferson's boys, they're having dinner, and they're like, dude, this is wrong. Like, they know it's wrong. Jefferson wouldn't shut up, right? Madison was like, yo, chill, just stop talking so much. And he said, no. He said, yeah, I don't think this is right. They know it's wrong. So yeah, there is some ambiguity with some issues, but I think for too long, we're in that both sides mess now, right? When we have to listen to both sides. No, that shit is just wrong. Like, Nazism is wrong. Denying people's humanity because of their sexuality is just wrong. And we should say that. That shouldn't be partisan.
Yeah. Professor Jeffries, I agree with you, and I don't mean to imply, certainly in the teaching of young kids, that I was teaching them,
I know what you're coming from.
it really had to do with, call it for what it is, but let's take out what we can.
Yeah, never be afraid to make judgments. Yes, Becky.
Thanks so much. I wanted to ask about the development of pedagogy along with these kind of broad historical movements that we're thinking about. I know that as a teacher, I think like the history plays a role in my classroom and in my pedagogical decisions every day. And so I wanted to ask if you could speak to how pedagogy was shaped by integration and then transitional desegregation, how national trends in teaching have shifted.
Big stuff.
It is. I mean, one of the things that we see, and we can use sort of concrete examples, right? In the film, we were talking about the Clinton riot from yesterday, for those who had a chance to go back and
In Mississippi.
In Mississippi. Well, pick a state, right? I mean, you have Colfax in Louisiana, you have Wilmington in North Carolina, you have Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Colfax, for example, in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s and 50s in segregated schools, these events, these racial massacres, racial pogroms, are actually taught. They're discussed, but they're framed as riots. They're framed as these democratic efforts by white supremacists to undo the wrongs of Reconstruction, right? So it's a false narrative, right? But the history is there. What happens when you have desegregation and that particular framing of this history is being challenged by African American teachers in desegregated schools and parents in particular, is that suddenly those subjects just disappear. If it can't be taught from this white supremacist perspective, then it won't be taught at all. And that becomes part of that becomes what we begin to see happening in desegregation. And Black parents are like, I mean, this is part of the Black Power era. And why you get Black parents and parents of color saying, hold on, we want to control our schools because we're going into these schools, we're sending our children to these schools, and we're not being able to control the curriculum. But once you get that transitional desegregation, then suddenly these critical subjects that weren't being taught properly before just completely disappear. So it's not like people, that's what I call purposeful historical amnesia. We just pretend as though it never happened if we can't frame it in a particular way. That's why you can get a kid, right? Homeschooling, the question we had, the homeschooling question there. What does that have to do with race and racism? Everything. Especially when you think about Florida now, and one of the primary generators of curriculum for homeschooling is this Hillsdale College 1776 nonsense out of Michigan that now is being seeped into public schools in states like Florida, right? I mean, that, like, how do we teach it? So it's about content. Part of the reason why we can't agree on content is because you have people like, I'm not letting you teach that this way. And my Black parents too are like, sometimes you get parents, like white parents like, I don't teach about slavery, you're gonna make my kid feel, Kylie, because it's always Kylie. Kylie is gonna feel sad. But you have Black parents too, and I get this from teachers all the time, you have Black parents who are like, teachers like, I had a Black parent and they didn't want me to teach about slavery, right? Why? Right? It ain't about you, it's because it's been taught so poorly for so long. They don't trust you to teach it right. they don't trust you to teach it right. Like, that's not a personal thing. That's a logical thing. Like, you're not gonna abuse my child by teaching this incorrectly because you haven't proven collectively to be able to teach it right. So I think the pedagogy question, how do we teach this, is so critical, but we have to acknowledge that we've been teaching it poorly for too long.
I also think you really do have to speak to an overlay of the conception of the child. So you come into the 1920s with John Dewey thinking, you know, having a child-centered approach to teaching. Turns out that Black children were not considered children. They lose their ability to be children, and that actually still exists today. So you have 14, 15-year-old children who are regarded as, quote, adults. And so I think that who you think you are teaching is as important as what you think you are teaching. And I would recommend to your audience a book by Jarvis Gibbons, who is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, called Fugitive Pedagogy, which looks at Carter G. Woodson's approach to teaching and teaching Black children.
One thing, which is one sentence, just a plug for another book by Crystal Webster called Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, which shows in the early 19th century, Black parents had to fight to have their children seen as children. In the age when the idea of childhood during Romanticism was taking place, it was something they had to struggle for because they wanted that kind of childhood for their children as well. It was a real struggle.
Wow, I'm glad we have some pedagogy experts here. Thank you. Again, what a panel. Every panel we're going to do here could go on and on and on. But lunch is upstairs. And it's free if you register for this conference. A quick last thought. We just started this discussion, this rich discussion. God, we didn't even have to create any conflict here. This was cool. There's a reason we have passion about this. It matters. It really, really matters. Whatever year that Roots played on television, 76, I think it was, we lost control of our school. The halls were chaos. Night after night, people were, slavery. You know, and we were trying to teach about it, not knowing we were doing it, but we didn't know what we were doing. And I remember it so vividly as a moment when past and present just blew into one another. And I think we're sort of experiencing that now in a sort of slow way, punctuated here and there by events. But I'm afraid I'm old enough to be teaching when the Roots played on television. And like every kid had just seen slavery. And parents had. And I'm sure you're experiencing that now in ways in your classrooms that they saw this film, they saw that pundit, or they read that book, or whatever. Let's keep all these conversations going. A little last point. We're having a breakout session with lunch, which means grab your lunch upstairs at the big buffet. And in room 203 above us, we can fit at least 40 people, I think. We have a breakout with these two wonderful student assistants I've mentioned before. We're going to talk a little bit about the kind of amazing discourse about all this that's been going on social media, on the internet, and various other sources. And we'll also just kind of have an open discussion, almost an open mic, a controlled open mic. Okay, thanks. Lunch upstairs. Thank you.